last week when I was talking about the time I spent in Azerbaijan almost dying by Doritos and ice balls from 6-year-olds, I told you at the same time Krista was living in India. And her team was under the same exact safety guidelines that mine was, which the females weren't to travel by themselves. But that was a lot easier for her team because there's only 8 of them on her team, and about half were male, half were female. It was also a lot easier because the females on that team were quite mature. In fact, on that team, it wasn't their fault. It was the fault of 2 18-year-old boys by the name of Matt and Robert that were a little hot-headed that caused the problems. And it all started when they got tired of eating chicken. Okay? If you don't know this, India is a Hindu country. It means they don't eat beef because they worship cows. That's where we get the phrase holy cow. If you go to McDonald's in India, the Big Mac meal is a chicken tikka masala Big Mac meal. And so you got these 2 18-year-old boys that are just tired of eating nothing but chicken over and over again. And so they made a secret plan to sneak out and go purchase some black market beef from the Muslim quarter of India. And so there's another young man on their team by the name of Ben. And Ben, for some reason, just felt like he was supposed to go with them. And so to their credit, I'm sure it was a very frustrating experience. The 3 young 18-year-old boys climbing in the back of a rickshaw. Those things aren't exactly made to fit that many people. Traveling, having not eaten beef for quite a while, but they get on the road and here's what happens. There's another driver of a rickshaw next to them that begins to kind of mock them and just shouts profanities at them. And instead of just letting it go, Matt and Robert began to engage back and forth with him and yell back with them. And it escalated to the piece of road rage where all of them ended up out of the rickshaws. And what happened was Robert ended up punching another rickshaw driver. Now, if you don't know what India looks like, that means this is in the middle of a street with hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Lots of rickshaw drivers. And so the moment this happened, all the other drivers, they physically separated Matt and Robert and Ben, and they took Robert away and they drug him down a back alley. Now here's what happened. Matt was psyching himself up to go and fight 100 Indians. Like he was trying to get himself pumped up. Ben had no such desire. He didn't want to fight in any way, shape, or form. It makes sense because he's Canadian. Okay, so he had no interest at all in fighting. But what Ben did was this. He did have the wisdom to pick up his phone, and he called a local contact that was able to reach out to the police and explain what was going on. And the police were able to track down Robert and save him before incredible harm came to him. So Matt, Robert, and Ben all spent the night in Indian jail, but at least they were alive. Now, here's the thing. Those are 2 different stories, last week's and this week's. If you remember my Azeri story with Caroline and Erica, 4 teenagers in completely different cultures that ended up in very similar situations within minutes of being harmed, maybe even killed, if God hadn't sent someone with them to intervene on their behalf. And why did that happen? Well, if you're here, you know we talked about it last week. All of them were raised in cultures that worship independence. And it's this worship of independence, it's this, I'll call it what it is, self-sufficiency, that is so deeply ingrained in us that sometimes we don't even realize it's there. We don't recognize or see it. In fact, last week I made the comment that because most of us grew up in the American culture, that we worship independence. We worship self-sufficiency. And at our core, we think that we are stronger than or better than other people because of it. We may not even realize it's there. And you may have shook your head at that. You may have rolled your eyes. But you also laughed when I said that Ben was Canadian. Right? And so it goes deeper sometimes than we ever realize. And here's the thing. This lie of independence, this lie of self-sufficiency, that's a design of the enemy that he wants us to submit to, that he wants us to think that looks like a good thing so that we give our life over to it, not realizing it's going to cause us incredible harm. It might even kill us. And so here's what we're doing. We're wrapping up our 2-part series message from last week. So we're continuing in week 3 of our Hidden Curses series. And that's what we're looking at. Things that look good on the outside, that sound good, that feel good. But once you get up close, you see that it's not all it was promised to be, that it's actually a half-truth. It's a lie from the enemy that's meant to disturb us, to confuse us and make us fearful so that we live the way that the enemy desires that we live instead of the way that God designed us to live. And we started by looking at this hidden curse of independence, which is based off this half-truth or lie of the enemy, where he tells us the more self-sufficient we are, the more satisfying our life will be. But what we actually learned last week was the opposite true. The more self-sufficiency we gain, actually the lonelier we become and the less mature we become. And so we summed that up last week by saying this. We said, to each his own leaves us each alone. Okay, so here's what Paul said that we're supposed to do. This is the what that we're covering. We covered last week. We as mature Christians are supposed to not have apathy toward others, but take action toward others and step into their lives and help bring healing and restore them so that they too can be in step with the Spirit. Okay, so that's the what that Paul has called us to do. And what we want to cover today is how he calls us to do it, and why it's so important that we do it that way. And so we're going to keep our phrase from last week, to each his own leaves us each alone, but we're going to add to it. And this week we're going to focus on the part that says, and that harmful isolation requires humble intervention. So when we get into this curse, this hidden curse, and we fall prey to it, we become isolated. It's incredibly harmful to us. And at that point, what that requires for our life is humble intervention on behalf of someone else. So that's what we're going to learn today, and we're going to be, again, in Galatians 6, 1 through 10. So I'll read verse and recap that for you real quick, verse 1, and then we'll continue. In verse 1, Paul just said this. He said, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person. And so what we learned last week, that brothers and sisters, it means he's talking to a group of Christians here. And so that means that there are people in the church that are justified or saved, but that are not sanctified. They're not mature in their faith. And what Paul is calling us to do, he says if someone is caught in a sin, meaning they're overcome by or surprised by sin, we should restore them. That's a medical term. So we should bring healing into their life by helping them get back in step with the Spirit. Being back in step with the Spirit was part of what it looks like to be a mature follower, to be someone, as Paul says, that's spiritual, someone that walks in the Spirit, that is led by the Spirit, and that keeps in step with the Spirit. And so that's what he has called us to do, as those of us that live by the Spirit, is to help others live by the Spirit. But this is how he says we're to do it. He says you are to restore that person gently. Just one word, gently. Now, I also made a comment last week. I said all restoration involves confrontation. Right? And here's the thing about confrontation. Confrontation is very uncomfortable for us. If I step into someone's life and I confront a sin in their life, that's uncomfortable for me. Do you know who else it's uncomfortable for? The person that you're confronting, the person who you're stepping into their life. But we have to remember this. That term restore, that was a medical term, right? A medical term used for resetting a bone. And here's the thing about surgery of any type. Surgery of any type is never comfortable. But what it is necessary for healing. Right? So it's never comfortable, but it is necessary for healing. But here's the thing about surgery. It's only going to take if it's done gently. If you have a broken bone and a doctor tries to reset it and he doesn't do it gently, does it forcefully, he's going to cause more trouble than you had when you started. Someone else is going to have to come in behind him and restore what you have made even worse than it was at first. Right? And so Paul is calling us to do the same thing here when we restore people and bring healing into their life spiritually. He says we must do it gently, because if we don't do it gently, it might not take. Right? It might not be received the way it needs to be received. And so what does it mean then to do it gently? Well, turn back with me, maybe just a page here, but Galatians chapter 5. Starting in verse 22, Paul gives us the list of the fruit of the Spirit. He says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. So this is the baseline of walking in the Spirit. This is the baseline of being a follower of Jesus. If you look at your life, and none of these fruits are in your life at all, you can't call yourself a follower of Jesus. That sounds really harsh, but you have to remember, Jesus says, if we want to follow him, if we want to be in his kingdom, then we have to be born again. We have to be born of the Spirit instead of the flesh. And here's the thing. It doesn't mean we won't struggle with some of these things occasionally, but if there's no evidence of this anywhere in your life, then there's no Spirit in your life. There's no Spirit in your life, then you're not really following Jesus. You've confused yourself. Because here's the thing about being born from something. Whenever we are born of something, we will have undeniable traits of that thing. Right? Essie was born with a square face, a bubble butt, and thunder thighs. Right? We were told that she'd be 50% me and 50% Krista. Our order got mixed up. She's 90% me. Okay? Now we are praying desperately that Scanlon genes kick in before she reaches adolescence. But here's the thing. You can't deny that kid is mine because she comes from me. It's the same thing with the Spirit. If you're born of the Spirit, you can't deny it. There will be traits in your life that say, I come from the Spirit. And so these are the traits that should be in our life. But here's the other thing I love about this. Do you know what the fruits of the Spirit really are? They are God's divine character attributes. That's what we inherit from the Father. Right? And so when God's presence is in us, his divine character attributes will come out of us. And one of those divine attributes is gentleness. So here's what we're going to call gentleness today. Gentleness is supernatural humility. It's not our own humility. It's God's supernatural humility imparted to us. That's what gentleness is. And so when Paul tells us we restore someone, if we do it in our own pride and our own flesh and our own power, we're not going to heal them. We're going to hurt them. Right? That's why we are told by Paul that it's those of you that walk by the Spirit, those of you that live by the Spirit, those are the ones that restore people, because when we are living by the Spirit, we will have divine attributes of God in us, like gentleness. And so when we are walking in the Spirit and we restore people and seek to do it, it's done in God's power, not ours. And so then here's what happens. I get uncomfortable because I'm restoring someone, but I grow. I grow through that process. I mature because I keep in step with the Spirit. And the person that was restored, it's uncomfortable for them. It doesn't feel good, but they're restored. They grow. They mature in their faith. And who gets the glory for all of it? God, because it is done in his power. See, I grow, they grow, God gets the glory. That's the way that God designed this to work. Right? And so what we were called to do is step into people's lives and restore them to being in step with the Spirit. How we are called to do it is gently. And why we do it gently is really important. Because here's what Paul says. He says, but watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. So this is a message of self-inspection. Now, there's something in our culture that sounds really similar to self-inspection, but it's twisted just a little bit. You catch that thing? What our culture loves is introspection. Because here's what introspection says. Introspection says, look deep down inside yourself. Discover who you really are, and then use that discovery to justify your behavior. Okay? Here's the problem with that. If we're not in Jesus, and we look deep down inside of ourselves, we're going to see evil. Not good. We're bent toward evil. And so then we will use that revelation to justify evil behavior. Right? So Paul's not asking us here to be introspective. He's telling us that we are to self-inspect. And here's what self-inspection is. It's a medical thing, right? We're told to self-inspect for our health. We are told to self-inspect to check for things like breast or testicular cancer, because here's what they say. Here's how you thoroughly look for inconsistencies. And if you find these inconsistencies or areas of concern early on, and we decide that it is cancer, we have caught it early enough that we can treat it before it really hurts you or kills you. Right? Self-inspection. That's what Paul is telling us to do with our hearts in our lives. He's saying self-inspect. Look at yourself. Measure yourself to this list and ask yourself, am I in step with God's Spirit or am I out of step with it? Because if we're out of step with God's Spirit, especially when it comes to issues of pride and thinking that we don't sin or that we're saved by our own power, it's our own confidence, it's our own independence, that's what makes us who we are. When we fall prey to that, it's never good. Right? When we fall prey to that pride, it never turns out good. And so here's what this looks like. Chris and I talked about, it's been a few weeks ago now, but we have certain cuss words in our house, not normal cuss words. Right? So I've got another one. It's not really a cuss word, it's more of a cuss phrase. But if either of us say this, the other calls us on it. And it's the phrase, I would never do that. So if at any point one of us says, I would never do that, we call each other and we say, whoa, back up a little bit. Because here's what that phrase is. That phrase is a trap. That phrase is a trap, and I think Christians fall into this trap all of the time, because when we say I would never do that, here's what we're really saying. We're saying, I can't believe that person would do that. I'm better than that person because in my own power, I would never do such a thing. So when we say things like I would never do that, you know what that is? It's the equivalent of Satan purchasing a hunting license with our name on it, except we're the prey. Okay, I've never purchased a hunting license. I don't know how that works. Some of you caught that. That's okay. You get my gist. When we do that, it invites Satan into our life and says, hey, do your worst, because in my own power, I can handle it. Here's the problem with that. Problem is, when we're in our flesh, we are all capable of anything. I still remember when I was 18, Bible college the first time. I was at Cincinnati Christian University. And the church my family attended, we've been there 4 or 5 years. It was a really big church back then. Wouldn't be considered that big today. It was close to 1,000 people, but back then it was a big church. So I didn't really know the pastor personally or anything, but there was a tradition that he had to uphold that was the senior pastor took all of the Bible college students out individually for lunch once a year. And so he called me up and he says, I need to take you to lunch. So he says, you want to go to Skyline Chili there on Price Hill? I said, sure. So he met with me there. We had Skyline Chili. He talked to me for about an hour and a half. You know, this is what it looks like to help people follow Jesus and lead well and be a pastor and all these conversations. I was like, okay, sounds good. Went back to my dorm, went back to school. It was just a couple weeks later that my parents told me, hey, yeah, the pastor of our church, apparently he's been having an ongoing affair with someone who's been counseling the church for the past year. Oh, okay. A couple years ago, we were at a different church. I was new. Chris and I were painting my office. So it was getting late into the night. We wanted to finish it all. We were listening to Christian radio, try to keep us encouraged and just to finish the job. And there was a news bulletin that came across. And if you listen to Christian radio, that's not normal. They don't usually break for news. And so we put down our paintbrushes and we listened up. And they announced that Ravi Zacharias had died. And we cried. Man, Ravi Zacharias was like, he was huge to our adolescence. One of the greatest Christian apologists of all time. Just a mountain of a man spiritually that we looked up to. Came out not long after that he owned several massage parlors as fronts for human trafficking. You think we cried when he died? We wept when we found that out. That same office, a couple months later, when I was at that church, we had to ask a staff person to take just a temporary leave. He had gotten out of step with the Spirit in just about every way. A lot of people were getting hurt. And we tried to do it gently. Said, well, hey, listen, we'll even do your job for you and still pay you. You need to get some counseling, man. You need to get some help. He did not respond in the Spirit to that. He barged into my office. He tried to physically assault me. I don't know why church has always been a contact sport for me, but it just keeps happening, right? And so he came in. He tried to hurt me. He threatened my life, the life of my family, cussed me out for about an hour and a half. And we have the other staff, and they're there, and they're like, do we call the cops? What do we do? And I said, no, don't call the cops. So I worked him out of this for a little bit of time, and he left, and staff's like, we need to tell the security team at church. I'm like, I don't know. Listen, I think he just had a bad moment. I don't really think he's a threat. But they felt threatened, so for their sake, I'm like, all right, we'll talk to the security team. And when I talked to them, it was 2 retired cops, very decorated cops. And here's what they said. They said, it's good that you told us. This is what they said. They said, in our experience, almost always the reason that people get hurt is because they assume a person isn't capable of doing something. And here's what they said. They said, our experience has taught us that anybody is capable of doing anything. And so when I say that Chris and I, we don't use the words, I would never do that, it's because we are capable of doing anything. So instead what we say is things like Jesus, I am grateful that's not something I struggle with right now. Please keep me in step with your Spirit. Please keep maturing me. Please keep leading me so that I don't have to suffer from struggling with that. And that sounds like a small thing, but it's not, because here's what it does. It is a constant reminder that the only thing good about me is Jesus in me. Right? I can go to Walmart and walk next to someone that commits some heinous crime, and the only thing different between me and them is Jesus in me. That's it. And so if at any moment I get out of step with his Spirit, even for just a second, in my own flesh, guess what? I am capable of doing anything. And so that's why Paul tells us here, it is so important that we have these self-examinations, that we look and we say, how am I measuring up? Am I walking in the Spirit, or am I out of step with the Spirit? And he says if we do those examinations and we look and we see that we're in step with the Spirit, here's what he says. He says, then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. That sounds different from everything I just said, doesn't it? Let me explain. There's two types of pride. There's the kind that's the opposite of humility. It's what we call prideful. And then there's the kind that is like a celebratory expression. And that's what Paul's talking about here. All right, so let me explain it this way. Let's pick another fruit of the Spirit. Let's pick patience. All right, if you know me at all, you know that it's probably no surprise at all that patience is something that I've had to grow in over the years. And so let's say I sit down one morning for my quiet time, and I have a time of self-inspection, and I come to the conviction by the power of the Holy Spirit that I'm not being a very patient person. And so I repent and I ask God to help me walk in patience. And then I get up, I come into work, and as I'm driving in, I get to the roundabout. Somebody ends up honking, flipping me the bird, and I go, tisk, tisk. I can't believe that guy. I'm so much more patient than he is. You know what's going to happen? When I get home that afternoon, Essie will not have napped because she's teething, and she'll be screaming her head off. And Satan's going to go, how patient do you think you are? Here you go. Right? It becomes open season. Right? And so what Paul is saying here is he's saying, hey, this isn't a comparison between you and other people. When I say I'm more patient than that guy, that's pride. Right? That's prideful. No, what Paul is saying is good and worth celebrating is I am grateful that I'm more patient today than I was yesterday. Right? It's not about me and him. It's about me and me. It's about me and developing. And that's worthy of celebration. Sometimes we look at that, we're like, oh, no, we should celebrate growth. We should prioritize growth. And when we are growing and we see the Spirit leading and we are more mature in our faith tomorrow than we were today, we should celebrate. We should have pride in that because it's worthy of celebration. It's the life that God calls us to. And so to me to say to him, I'm more prideful than you, that's prideful. I'm more patient than you. But for me to say, I'm grateful that I am more patient today than I was yesterday, guys, that's worthy of celebration. But we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're not self-evaluating, right, if we're not self-inspecting, how would we know that I'm more patient today than I was yesterday? So we have to self-inspect and say, God, keep me in step with the Spirit. And then Paul's going to say one more thing there that is also going to sound a little backward, because then he's going to say, for each one should carry their own load. What? If you'll notice in verse 2, I skipped over it a little bit. I thought it'd be better to hit it here, but he says in verse 2, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. So the law of Christ is that we love one another. That's his will for us. And so to best love one another, we are to carry one another's burdens. And then he says down here in verse 5, for each one should carry their own load. What? Here's the context. And listen, if I've lost you already, pay attention again, because this is important. We have both an individual and a corporate faith. All right, they're not mutually exclusive. It's not just a private faith. It's not just a corporate faith. It's both. And this verse is going to help us understand the difference between the two. See, when Paul uses the word burden, in the first century context, that had the idea of carrying a heavy rock. And it was a heavy rock that was impossible to carry on your own. So the best case scenario was maybe you could drag it for a little ways, but it would weigh you down. It would discourage you. You would get tired. You wouldn't be living a full life. Worst case scenario, you see that it's impossible to carry on your own, and you just give up altogether. Right, but that's what it was, a burden. A burden was the result of the effects of sin in our world. And we all have these burdens. Okay, that's what Paul wants us to know. We all have these burdens. They come in different shapes and sizes and weights, but we all have them. Maybe it's a temptation that you struggle with, consequence of a past moral lapse that you've made when you've been out of step with the Spirit. Right? It could be a mental disorder. It could be a physical ailment. It could be a family crisis. It could be a situation. It could be unemployment. It could even be demonic oppression, right? It could be any of those things, right? We all have burdens. That's the point. And the point is, on our own, we won't finish the race. But God's intent is that we all carry those burdens together and we all cross the finish line together. So that's what he means when he says burden. When he says load, in the first century, that had the idea of a military satchel or a military backpack. It was specifically designed to be carried by one person, and only that person could carry it. And so when we're talking about the difference between burden and load, burden is something that we all carry together, right? The effects of sin in this world and the struggles that we have. But the load that we each carry, only we can carry that. Nobody else can carry that weight. And what that is our decisions on whether we are going to stay out of step with the Spirit and stay in sin, or whether we're going to get right and get back in step with the Spirit. Nobody else can carry that burden. And so we have a corporate responsibility, but I also have an individual responsibility. Okay? So think about it like this. If I had a moment in my life where I experienced incredible grief and loss, and in that incredible grief and loss, I turned to things I shouldn't turn to. Alcohol, pornography, drugs, food, doesn't matter. Anything I should be taking to Jesus, I'm taking it to these other things. And I get out of step with his Spirit. Those would be very normal trauma responses, right? We see that, we know that. I would be considered incredibly fortunate in that moment to have a mature Christian friend that loves me, that knows me, that cares about me, and that can gently step into my life to try to help restore me and bring healing to my life to put me back in step with the Spirit, okay? And that friend can and should help carry that burden of that loss, that burden of that grief. They carry it with me. What that friend cannot carry the weight of is my decision whether I'm going to keep sinning or whether I'm going to get back in step with the Spirit. I can only carry that. And listen, friends, that is God's design. It is God's design that we step into each other's lives and we share all of these burdens. But now let me tell you what it usually looks like. I mentioned earlier pastoral failings. And I did that because I wanted you to know that everybody, anybody, is capable of anything, myself included, when we're out of step with the Spirit. And the news, they like pastoral failings. They like to see pastors fall. Because pastors fall, they end up in sin, they hurt people, church ends up split or closing. And listen, Satan loves that. So it gets all the attention. But let me tell you, pastoral failings are actually quite rare. The biggest culprit for pastors leaving ministry is not usually a pastoral failing, it's something else. Most recent research said this. Most recent research said 42 to 56% of pastors, so let's just call it half, said half of pastors in the last year, not in their whole life, in the last year, have seriously considered leaving ministry. I need you to pay attention to this really quick. All right, and this isn't going to be like a woe is me thing, okay? What I'm trying to tell you here is I'm trying to let you into the pastoral life. I'm trying to let you into what has happened in the local church and the weight that people carry, because half of pastors actively are thinking of quitting. In our movement, 80% of openings go completely unfilled. There's no pastors left, and Satan loves it. And here's why it happens. 60+% of them all gave the same reason for why they're quitting ministry. You know what it is? Loneliness. Loneliness and the discouragement that comes from feeling alone. And again, I'm going to include some generalizations here. I speak to a lot of pastors through the years. I've helped coach churches, and I see the same patterns over and over and over again. But here's what happens. Here's what a pastor does. A pastor sees someone that's hurting. They see someone that's living over here. They see someone that has this burden that they're carrying. And they give their time and their energy and their resources, time and energy and resources that probably should go to their family, and they're giving it over here to this person so that they can see they're living over here. And they try to help them get back over here, and they insert themselves into their life, and they care about them, and they love them. And for some reason, despite this person having all the information, they make a cognizant decision to stay over here. And it breaks our heart, and it tears us apart. And then we walk into work the next day, and there's another one. Because in most churches, I can say this confidently, in most churches, the pastor's the only one doing that ministry. So let me ask you this. How long before a pastor that's serving on empty, that's giving everything they have, becomes lonely. They feel like it's just them. Could be a pastor, could be staff, could be a key few volunteers. I've seen it in all. How long before serving on empty do they get discouraged? How long before serving on empty do they think of quitting? How long before serving that way until you think they get out of step with the Spirit themselves because there's nobody to restore them? How long? This is what Satan has done in our churches. He's made it an individual experience. He's made it completely self-sufficient. He's made it the thing where it's just one or two people, they take on this ministry, but everyone else, they get to enjoy the benefits of the ministry. That's what Satan has done in our churches. When Chris and I were 20, newly married, fresh off the mission field, fresh off being married, in love with each other, in love with Jesus, life ahead of us, we moved back to Colorado Springs, had to find a church. There's lots of mega churches there. We attended one before we went overseas. But I said, let's find a smaller one. Let's find somewhere that we can serve. And so we found a church called Central Christian Church, corner of Pikes Peak Avenue in Old Colorado City. Had been there 150 years. So I emailed them and said, hey, we'd maybe be interested in coming and serving in your church. And the pastor emailed back and he said, hey, why don't I just we hadn't even attended yet. I said, why don't I just take you out to lunch? And we thought, we're broke, free food, awesome. So he took us out to Pizza Hut. We went through the buffet. We sit down at the booth. He starts telling us about the church. He said, I've been here about 15 years. I got 3 kids, one that just graduated, 2 that are still in the youth group. They said the church is about 200, maybe 250 people, so not much smaller than what we are now. And about 4 minutes into this conversation, he starts crying. Not like a little bit. Like he starts crying for 2 or 3 minutes straight. He eventually pulls himself together. He just says, I'm just so overwhelmed that someone would offer to come and help. So he said, why don't I go show you the church? So we get in the car to follow him, and we look at each other, and we're like, that was weird, right? So we follow him to the church. He gives us a tour. It ends up in his office. Krista's over in the corner talking to him about something. He's showing her something. I see a book on his desk. And I'm nosy, so I turn my head to the side. And I read the title. And the title of the book, I'll never forget it. It says, Leading on Empty, How to Keep Serving When You Have Nothing Left to Give. And I remember thinking to myself, 20 years old, fresh, new, I'll never struggle with that. What an idiot. We experienced some of our first biggest church hurt at that church. A lot of people did. A lot of people got hurt. I looked it up a couple years ago, 10 years after that. Again, a church not much different size than our own. 10 years later, their doors closed forever. 150 years of ministry gone. And let me tell you this, friends. You want to know what the culprit was? You want to know why that happened? It was the curse of independence. Because here's what Satan does. He convinces us to believe the lie that the more self-sufficient we are, the more satisfying our life will be. He convinces us that we don't need the help of others. He convinces us that other people don't need us to help them. He convinces us to leave each other alone. And God has to intervene. He has to send someone in the mold of Jesus to rescue us from that independence. To each his own. Leaves us each alone. And that harmful isolation requires humble intervention. My friends, that's the calling that he gave to all of us when he told us to make disciples. That's the charge that he gave to all of us in the mold of Jesus. Because look at Matthew 11, 28 through 30 real quick. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. How did Jesus intervene on our behalf? It says with gentleness and humility to show us to do the same. And when we do that, according to this scripture, what should the result be? Rest. What should the result be? His burden is easy. His yoke is light. So why does it feel so heavy? Why do so many people say, I just can't do that anymore? It's too heavy. Because it was meant to be done by all of us, not some of us. Because it was meant to be done by all of us, not some of us. Look at Galatians again, Galatians 6:9. I'll finish up here. Paul said, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. Compare this to the earlier part of the passage. Paul switches from using words like brothers and sisters, you, they, themselves. And then in verse 9 he says, let us not become weary in doing good, for we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Do you see the switch? See, the reason that all of us try to do good and try to help, the reason we're so exhausted all the time is because we bear a heavy burden, because everything in our culture drifts toward the hidden curse of independence. And so all of us end up lonely. All of us end up not reaching our full maturity. And the solution is that it turns from a me to a we. Right? The solution is that God's divine plan to redeem the world into himself, it's not accomplished by me, it's not accomplished by you, it's accomplished by us through God's power, through his Holy Spirit, through walking with the Spirit. And when we can do that together, that's when it becomes life-giving. That's when it becomes restful. That's when it becomes joyful. That's when it becomes hopeful, because that's when it's easy and light, when the burden is shared. So here's what I'm asking you to do today. I know last week and this week especially, they've been heavy messages. But also know I love you and I want what's best for you. And the best for you isn't giving into the curse of independence. The best for you is realizing and understanding that God has given us a way to live, that he has designed. And that's the way in our life that gives us hope and purpose. That's the way of our life that results in the fruits of the Spirit being lived out through us. That is the way that stands in contrast to the way the world lives, is by doing that together. And so what you're going to find is this. If you don't have this paper, there should be more in the drop. But on your sermon notes, I've got something on the bottom there that you can just tear off, and then you can drop it in any of the offering boxes on the side walls or the post on your way out. But on that sheet, it has 3 things listed. And there's 3 things that you can check. And listen, you don't have to check any of them. There's no pressure. There's no guilt. There's no condemnation. But I want my life to be ruined for the ordinary. Right? I don't want to live a normal life. I don't want you to live a normal life. I want you to be ruined for the ordinary. I want you to experience his presence. I want you to experience his purpose. I want you to experience his hope. And here's how you can do that. The first thing it's going to say is this. If you aren't a follower of Jesus, and you've realized you've camped over there your whole life, and you've realized that none of those fruits of the Spirit are in your life, and you look at that list, and you look at those things, and you say, love, I want more love in my life. Joy, I could use peace. Patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, I have no self-control. You look at that list and you say, that sounds a heck of a lot better than where I'm camping right now. Check that first box. Just say, I'd love to become a follower of Jesus. And we will talk you through that. We will walk through that with you. We will assign someone to help lead you into maturity. If you're here and you have settled, and you've said, you know what, I've settled for being saved and I haven't been sanctified. I've settled for just being in the justification and receiving the blood of Jesus, but I still don't exhibit most of these fruits of the Spirit because I still live out of step with it. I'm in my flesh. And because of that, I'm mixed up. I don't know what's what because the world's calling me and the church is calling me, and I feel torn between the two. If that's you, check that second box. You say, I would like someone to be assigned to me to disciple me, to help grow my faith. And then if you are here and you are fortunate that you have had other people invest in your spiritual life, that you have had other people keep you in step with the Spirit, and you're sitting there and you're like, well, what do I do now? Maybe you're retired. You don't have to be retired, but maybe you are, and you're like, well, what do I do now? Let me tell you what you do now is you check the third box. You check the box that says, I know it's going to be uncomfortable, but I am willing to help other people find maturity in Jesus. I'm willing to disciple somebody. And listen, I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't have some big program. My Bible college math tells me half of you raised your hands last week and half of you didn't. Sometimes it's just enough to be obedient and let the Spirit take it from there. So that's all I'm asking you to do is say, you know what? Listen, you don't have to. I'm not guilting you. There's no shame in this. But if you're like, you know what? There's more, and I know there's more. I'm telling you what it is. Jesus has set your life apart for a purpose, and this is it, because it's the purpose he gave all of us. So my encouragement to you is to look at that list and pray over it. Tear off that sheet, fill it out, drop it in an offering box. Somebody will be in contact with you in the next few weeks. But my challenge to you today is this. Don't settle for ordinary. Don't settle for the hidden curses. Don't believe the lie of independence. Jesus created us to be interdependent, not only on him, but on one another, and that's where we find our rest. That's when the yoke is easy and light, is when we're all in this together. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you that you didn't have apathy toward us, but you took action on our behalf. And I thank you for the written word that we know what you've asked us to do. We know what you've called us to do. So God, I don't know where everybody's at in here this morning, but I know there's people in this room that you are on their hearts. And you are convicting them that they need to make a decision either to come to you or to help others come to you. And so God, I just ask that all of us would take this moment to do some self-inspection and ask ourselves if we are living the life that you have called us to live. And God, if we aren't, flood us with your grace and your mercy, and flood us with your conviction by your Spirit, that as long as we have you in us, sometimes obedience is more than enough, because you'll take it from there. So God, we give you permission to take it from here. It's in Jesus' name I pray.